My name is Eleanor Carrington, and I'm 65 years old. At this stage in life, I've learned the value of patience, the weight of memories, and the quiet power of knowing your limits. Tonight, I was testing those limits without even realizing it as I pulled into the driveway of my daughter Madison's Charleston townhouse. The brick facade gleamed under the late afternoon sun, and perfectly trimmed hydrangeas framed the steps, an image of order and grace that always made me feel slightly out of place. Inside, Madison greeted me with her usual brisk hug, her eyes scanning me like she was noting the faint gray in my hair or the new lines along my jaw. "Hi, Mom," she said, the politeness practiced but thin. She led me into the dining room where the table was set meticulously candles. Flickering mother-of-the-bride placemats laid out, even though her own mother-in-law would be joining us shortly. And there she was, Caroline Madison's mother-in-law, already perched at the head of the table, smiling in a way that felt more like appraisal than warmth. Caroline's presence had always carried a subtle tension, a quiet judgment that hovered over every conversation, every shared bite of food. I knew how to navigate it. Smile, nod, pour the wine, keep the peace. But tonight, something inside me hummed a warning. As I took my seat, Madison immediately reached for the wine bottle. "Mom, could you pour for Caroline?" she asked, her voice light but commanding, as if the words themselves carried an expectation. I paused, feeling the familiar coil of restraint tighten in my chest. Every instinct screamed compliance, yet a tiny spark of defiance flickered, refusing to be drowned in years of habit. I set my hands in my lap and smiled faintly, letting the wine sit untouched for a heartbeat longer than usual. A small ripple ran through the table, almost imperceptible. But I noticed. Carolyn's smile tightened. Madison's fingers drummed on the table edge. And in that silence, I realized the calm before a storm was never truly peaceful. Madison's hand hovered over the wine bottle again, her fingers tapping lightly against the glass, as if counting down my compliance. "Mom really could. You just pour a little for Caroline? It's nothing," she said. Her voice deceptively casual, but the edge in it betrayed the expectation beneath. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, a coil of reflexive obedience I had carried for decades. Every instinct told me to lift the bottle, tilt it carefully, and serve without comment. Years of family dinners of smiling through entitlement and veiled criticism screamed that I should stay small, stay accommodating. But tonight, something inside me refused to obey. I set my hands flat on the table, holding them there deliberately. "No," I said quietly, almost beneath my breath, though firm enough for her to hear. "I'm not pouring it." The words landed like a pebble thrown into still water. Madison's smile faltered for the barest instant, replaced by a quick, sharp twitch of irritation. Caroline's lips pressed into a tighter line, her eyes narrowing slightly, a silent appraisal of my audacity. The room felt heavier. Suddenly, every movement amplified the clink of the wine glasses, the quiet hum of the ceiling fan, even the soft padding of Carolyn's feet across the hardwood floor. Madison leaned back slightly, crossing her arms as if to brace herself, while Caroline's gaze held mine, measuring. A flicker of pride ran through me, small and startling, alongside the knot of anxiety in my stomach. For the first time in a long while, I realized that refusing, simply refusing, was an assertion of something I had almost forgotten existed my own will. The ripple of tension stretched across the table, quiet but unmistakable, as the calm before a storm settled in once more. I hadn't even lifted the wine bottle when it happened. Madison's hand shot out faster than I could process, and the ceramic bowl sailing through the air seemed to move in slow motion. It struck my cheek with a sharp crack, splintering lettuce and droplets of vinaigrette across my blouse. Warm pain lanced across my face, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. The room froze. Caroline, perched at the head of the table, didn't flinch. Her eyes glimmered with something cold, a sneer forming on her lips that made my stomach twist. "Servants should know their duties," she said, her tone sharp, dripping with that quiet superiority I had long despised but endured. I staggered back instinctively, hand pressed against the sting of the ceramic warm blood, mixing with the tang of vinegar. My vision blurred at the edges, not just from the pain, but from disbelief. How could my own daughter, my Madison, betray me so openly, so violently over something so trivial? Madison's face was taut, every line carved in fury, her eyes daring me to respond. The confident smirk she usually wore in public was gone, replaced by raw, impatient heat. The room had shrunk around me, the polished wooden table, the carefully arranged candles, the quiet clatter of utensils, all of it sharpened into a spotlight on my humiliation. I wanted to scream, to cry, to strike back, but none of it came. My body moved on autopilot, stepping away, retreating toward the safety of the hallway. My chest heaved, heart pounding like a drum in my ears, the sting of betrayal heavier than the physical pain. I had spent decades bending, yielding, accommodating every expectation, every demand, and yet this public act of violence cut deeper than any reprimand, any silent resentment I had swallowed over the years. Caroline's eyes never left mine. Madison's breathing was sharp, deliberate, and in that stillness I felt a spark I hadn't recognized before, a clarity, a shock that had the weight of truth. The roles I had been forced into, caretaker, peacemaker, shadow, no longer bound me in that moment. I turned, walking stiffly toward my room, each step echoing against the hardwood floor. The door closed behind me with a slam that sounded louder than any words I could have spoken. The quiet that followed wasn't surrender. It was the beginning of something else, something I didn't yet fully understand, but would soon claim for myself. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, the cool wood pressing into my back as if grounding me. My hand went immediately to the cut on my cheek fingertips, brushing over the sting of broken skin and the warmth of blood that ran slower than I expected. I dabbed at it with a napkin from my purse, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the ache of betrayal. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I let my mind drift to the years that had led me here. Raising Madison had never been simple. From the moment she was old enough to speak, she had expected obedience, her whims prioritized above all else. Every family gathering, every meal prepared, every smile I forced had been a careful choreography to maintain peace, to avoid conflict, that Carolyn seemed determined to manufacture. The memories unfolded quietly, a relentless slideshow, early mornings, ironing tiny clothes, while Caroline offered unsolicited advice on everything from my parenting to my posture. Afternoons spent retrieving Madison's forgotten items, attending to her temper with a practiced calm I had long mistaken for affection. The decades of accommodating her and the constant subtle judgments from her mother-in-law had built an invisible cage around me, one I hadn't realized I was living inside until now. I pressed my hand to my cheek again, tasting the copper tang of blood, and for the first time, I allowed a small flicker of something I hadn't felt in years: defiance. The anger, sharp and steady, wasn't aimed at Madison alone, but at the entire weight of expectation I had carried silently. This moment, terrible as it was revealed, what had been buried, my own capacity to resist, to finally recognize that my service to them had limits. I leaned back against the headboard, breathing slow and deliberate. The house downstairs was quiet now. The murmur of conversation faded into nothing. In that silence, I realized I didn't need to speak to reclaim myself. I only needed to understand that the boundary I had ignored for decades could begin here in this small, quiet space of my own choosing. I closed my eyes and let the memories wash over me, unbidden but insistent. Raising Madison had been a lifetime of careful calculation, a balancing act between love duty and survival. From the day she toddled across the polished floors of our Charleston home, her demands had been clear. She expected attention, deference, and the quiet accommodation of her whims. Caroline had never hidden her judgments. Her thinly veiled critiques threaded through every holiday, every meal, every family outing. I remembered the Thanksgiving when she'd corrected my turkey carving in front of Madison's friends, her hands hovering like a shadow of authority. My own opinion, my own effort, invisible beneath her quiet insistence that I do it the right way. Madison clapped politely, oblivious or unconcerned, while I smiled tightly, nodding, swallowing my irritation. Every birthday, every school recital, every scraped knee or forgotten homework had been met with the expectation that I would handle it silently and efficiently. Caroline's praise was rare, reserved for Madison's smallest achievements, a nod or a smile that made me feel invisible by comparison. I learned quickly that to survive in that household, my own needs, my own pride had to be deferred indefinitely. Even the small indignities, fetching forgotten shoes, preparing a meal exactly to Caroline's specifications, listening to Madison's endless chatter about her friends' accomplishments, had built an invisible pattern around me. The years blurred each one, reinforcing a system of expectation I hadn't questioned until the bowl hit my cheek. And yet, amidst the frustration and exhaustion, I recognized something I had almost forgotten: my capacity for patience and resilience. For decades, I had endured not because I was weak, but because I had cared, and because I had hoped, always hoped, that one day my efforts might be recognized. Now, after the storm of the dinner, I saw the patterns clearly, and with them, the outlines of a choice I had long avoided: to step out of that cycle, to reclaim the agency I had quietly ceded for too long. I spent the evening alone in my room, the soft Charleston breeze slipping through the half-open window, carrying the distant hum of crickets and the occasional honk of a passing car. My cheek throbbed gently, a lingering reminder of the bowl. But it no longer felt like a mark of humiliation. It was a spark, a signal that something had to change. I thought about the patterns that had governed my life for decades. The automatic deference to Madison's whims, the quiet obedience to Caroline's subtle demands, the invisible rules I had followed without question. For the first time in years, I imagined a different way, one where I could participate in family life without erasing myself. Carefully, I began to outline small steps. I would speak firmly, not out of anger, but with clarity. I would hold my ground when asked to serve beyond reason. I would set limits around my time, my energy, and my dignity. Nothing dramatic, nothing confrontational, yet just the quiet assertion of boundaries. I also considered contingencies. What if Madison reacted badly? What if Caroline tried to manipulate the situation? I made mental notes, quietly rehearsing phrases and gestures that could protect me without escalating the storm. For the first time in decades, hope threaded through the knot of anxiety in my chest. I realized that reclaiming my space wouldn't be instant, but careful planning could give me a foothold, a beginning toward freedom I had almost forgotten existed. The next family gathering arrived with all the usual pomp, the polished hardwood floors gleaming under the chandelier, the scent of roasted chicken drifting through the air. Eleanor adjusted her cardigan and took a deep breath before stepping into Madison's dining room. She had rehearsed her words quietly all week, her resolve coiling steadily beneath the calm exterior. Madison's eyes flicked toward her as soon as she entered, a subtle challenge hidden behind a polite smile. Caroline, seated at the head of the table, gave a thin-lipped nod that felt more like scrutiny than welcome. Eleanor met their gazes steadily, her heart thumping, but her voice remained clear and even. Madison Caroline. She began placing her hands on the edge of the table. I will not be serving the wine tonight. I'm here to join you all, not to be your personal attendant. A flicker of disbelief crossed Madison's face. Mom, come on, it's just a small thing, she said, the edge of command in her tone unmistakable. Eleanor shook her head gently. No, it's not a small thing. Not when I've spent decades accommodating every whim, every expectation, without acknowledgement or respect. Tonight, I am participating as myself, not as someone's servant. The room went quiet. Every subtle noise amplified the clink of silverware, the soft hum of the ceiling fan, even Caroline's deliberate intake of breath. Caroline's gaze sharpened, measuring Eleanor's resolve, while Madison's fingers drummed on the table, her smirk faltering. For a heartbeat, Eleanor felt the familiar coil of fear, the tension she had carried for decades. But beneath it, a stronger current ran moral courage, the quiet thrill of reclaiming a space she had long ceded. She did not raise her voice, did not gesticulate. She simply held her ground, her presence steady, her dignity intact. Neither Caroline nor Madison spoke further, their discomfort palpable. Eleanor allowed a small, private smile to form, knowing the moment was a turning point. The table was still tense, the air heavy, but she had planted the seed. Her boundaries would no longer be invisible. As the first course was served, Eleanor sat back slightly, feeling the weight of anticipation, knowing that the real reckoning, her confrontation with the years of expectation and entitlement, was only just beginning. The morning sunlight filtered through Eleanor's bedroom window, casting a warm glow over the desk where she had gathered everything she would need. Photographs of the cut on her cheek lay stacked neatly, each one a testament to the physical and emotional toll of decades-long expectation. Messages from family group chats, subtle remarks and reminders long ignored, were printed and organized evidence of the patterns she had quietly endured. She ran her fingers over the edge of a photo, the sting of memory sharp as ever. Each image carried more than the marks of that night. They carried the weight of years, small indignities, constant demands, the invisible labor she had performed without acknowledgement. It was undeniable, irrefutable proof of what she had lived with silently for so long. Eleanor paused, inhaling deeply. Gathering the evidence had already shifted something inside her. She felt steadier, more grounded, as though the tangible weight of proof had solidified the resolve she had been nurturing quietly for weeks. For the first time, the fear of confrontation was balanced by a sense of moral clarity. She wasn't simply upset or angry, she was justified, armed with truth. She organized everything into a neat folder, each document and photo, in order of chronology. A list of prior incidents, small but meaningful, marked patterns of entitlement and control. Eleanor rehearsed the way she would present it, calm, deliberate, firm. She would not shout, not lash out. She would let the facts speak, let the evidence hold the weight of accountability where words alone had failed. Later, as she tucked the folder into her bag, Eleanor felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself in years' anticipation. This confrontation wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't erase the years, but it would mark the beginning of recognition, of validation for her experiences. She could feel the subtle shift within herself, empowerment replacing hesitation, clarity replacing doubt. Every photograph, every message, every note was a step toward reclaiming her life, a tangible measure of the dignity she had been denied. She straightened her shoulders, smoothing her cardigan, and looked into the mirror. The reflection staring back was steady, resolved, unafraid. Tonight, she would no longer be invisible. Tonight, the truth would speak for her. Eleanor entered the dining room with the folder clutched firmly in her hands, her steps measured and steady. Madison's smile faltered as she noticed the intensity in her mother's gaze. Caroline, seated at the head of the table, glanced up from her plate, sensing the shift in the air. "Sit down," Eleanor said, calmly, placing the folder in the center of the table. She opened it slowly, revealing photographs of her cut cheek, printed messages and notes, documenting the countless small indignities she had endured over the years. The room fell silent. Madison's fingers hovered uncertainly over the wine glass. "Mom, what is this?" she asked, her voice slightly unsteady, a hint of defensiveness breaking through her usual composure. Eleanor met her daughter's eyes. "This is the record of the behavior I have tolerated for far too long. The bowl, the words, the expectations you have treated me as though I am invisible. No more." Caroline's lips pressed into a thin line, and she shifted in her seat, the faintest sign of discomfort flashing in her expression. Eleanor's words were calm, yet every syllable carried the weight of years of suppressed frustration and endurance. "I will not continue to serve as anyone's shadow," Eleanor continued, voice steady. "I am present in this family as myself, with respect for my own time, my own dignity, and my own boundaries." The folder remained open evidence, displayed undeniable and deliberate. Madison's usual confidence wavered, and Caroline's eyes flicked away, avoiding the mirror of truth Eleanor had held up to them. Eleanor felt a surge of clarity and strength. The cycle of entitlement, manipulation, and silent compliance had been broken, not with anger, but with measured assertion and irrefutable proof. For the first time in decades, Eleanor's presence at the table was hers alone, and the subtle tremor of shock in the room confirmed the shift. The long-standing patterns had finally met their match, and Eleanor knew she would no longer yield to them. The days that followed felt strangely lighter, though not without adjustment. Eleanor had rearranged her routines, claiming spaces and moments that were hers alone. Breakfast no longer came with a sense of obligation to appease Madison or Caroline. She brewed her coffee, slowly savoring the aroma, listening to the faint bustle of Charleston streets outside her window, without the usual knot of anxiety twisting in her chest. When Madison visited, their conversations were careful, measured, framed by the boundaries Eleanor had established. Madison still carried traces of entitlement, but Eleanor no longer wavered. She responded with calm firmness, no longer offering herself as a shadow or a servant. Caroline, too, seemed to shrink back slightly, her once unyielding presence softened by the recognition that Eleanor's autonomy would not be compromised. Eleanor filled her afternoons with activities that had long been deferred, walking along the Battery at sunset, tending to the small garden she had neglected, and reading in quiet corners without interruption. Each task, each choice, reaffirmed that the life she lived now was truly her own. The subtle satisfaction of independence coursed through her steadily like the ebb and flow of the tide against Charleston's shoreline. Evening meals were simpler, quieter, and no longer arenas of expectation. Eleanor's calm presence set a new rhythm. The household adjusted around her autonomy, not the other way around. The tension that had always threaded through family interactions loosened gradually, leaving space for genuine connection, or when that wasn't possible, respectful distance. As she sank into her favorite chair with a cup of tea, Eleanor felt the weight of decades lift slightly from her shoulders. She was present in her own life, no longer defined by others' demands or judgments. Peace, she realized, wasn't sudden or absolute, but deliberate, earned through patience, courage, and the quiet assertion of self. For the first time in years, she could breathe fully, knowing that she had claimed her life on her own terms, and that claim, firm and unwavering, would not be taken from her again.